I think of Donald Trump like Bob Dylan. And by that, I mean that he...
Hold on a minute. Are we recording this?
Yeah.
We're certainly blowing in the wind, but what... Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Show podcast. My name is Jon Stewart. I come to you today broken, but not bowed. For I had an Owwy on my finger. I'm going to show it now. You're probably, I wrapped it up. I heard it on the show doing my classic brand of physical slapstick comedy that never works and always gets me hurt. It's the second time on The Daily Show that I have broken a drinking vessel. The first one was glass. The second was ceramic, for those who thought I should have had a breakaway mug. Yeah! Now you tell me. Yes, Sunset. Ceramic is one of my least favorite materials to have embedded in my skin. But I bled out. It really, for a comedian, is humiliating. And I say that because the greats, the Buster Keatons, the Charlie Chaplins, Buster Keaton would stand, in front of a house with a little window cut out. It would fall on his head. Harold Lloyd would hang off of a clock with no net. I nearly died being vociferous with a coffee mug. It does not speak well of the legends of my business. But I don't imagine they ever had to have their sets childproofed. Can I tell you what's not smart to do when you have a cut? Hold it below your heart for 20 minutes. Because it really does. It just makes your whole arm a straw. And it just flows out. And it makes it look way worse than when I picked it back up to look at it. Even I, for a second, was like, was I shot? It's fine. But so it goes, as Kurt Vonnegut would say, so it goes. We have a ton to get to today. We're taping on Wednesday, so God knows if we'll even still be in the alliances that we were in the day before. But I'm excited to talk to you today. There's so much that's going on, and we talk about Democrats and liberals and Republicans and conservatives and DOGE and MAGA. I wanted to get kind of the libertarian view, and I know that's not monolithic in any way, but I thought there's no better person to get that from than our guest today. So let's get to that right now. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very pleased in this moment to have with us Nick Gillespie, editor-at-large of Reason Magazine, host of the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie podcast. Nick, the OG, in my mind, of kind of grounded libertarian thought is in my mind, I think of Nick Gillespie, and I'm very pleased that you could be here and join us today.
Oh, well, thank you, John. It's a real treat, and it's always nice to be called grounded, because normally I'm talked about as something less than grounded. So thank you.
Is that really true? Because, it's so interesting to me. Libertarian is, you think of political movements sometimes and you have a tendency to group them as a monolith. And the libertarian movement is anything but a monolith. It has, there's this sort of, the side of it that's getting maybe the most attention in this day and age is maybe the kind of more edgelord side of it, that kind of young male. But when I call you the OG, I feel like you were always grounding everything in Friedman and Hayek and, all the things that you imagine libertarianism's foundation is built upon. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think so. And, part of it is that I grew up as a journalist, or I started working as a journalist, then I went to grad school for literary studies. And then, I had to come back. It was still in my blood. Somehow the big payoff in being an English professor didn't materialize.
So you didn't get your start in dank memes. That was not how you got your start with all this.
I actually did get my start working at teen magazines and music magazines. I worked for a place called Teen Machine at some point.
Teen Machine.
even in my teen mag days, I
Yes.
was always interested in starting with like some facts. You know, it's not like a card you lay down and then the conversation stops. But starting, I've been at Reason since early the 1993. The magazine started in 1968. I did a cover story about how everybody was talking about, and this was a big Hillary Clinton thing. You know, that children were at risk like they had never been before, like, you know, worse than the Little Rascals. Those kids had it good compared to kids growing up in the fucking like late 1990s.
Yeah.
And all I started with was like a list of, you know, how much better children are doing.
Let's start with one. No polio. Okay, let's move on from there.
I'm 61 years old. I was born in 1963. The average lead levels in kids growing up in the 60s would have triggered massive medical interventions in the late 90s because you know, lead gasoline, lead paint, lead pencils, you know, lead cereal, I'm sure. You know,
Ledios, I believe it was called. It was delicious, stayed crunchy. The one cereal that stayed crunchy in the bowl was Ledios.
And they filled you up for the whole day. Yeah. No, but so, I mean, this just gets back to the point of like, I think it's always important to, when we start talking about stuff, especially today, because, you know, people are nuts, is like, can we agree on some common facts, right?
People Are Nuts would be a good title for the book. Yeah. But Nick, so you just gave me in many ways the perfect segue kind of into our conversation, because I think I want to talk to you about DOGE and how you're feeling about that, the Trump administration, all those things. But first, I think I've always been libertarian curious, if that would be the right.
Yeah. Every comedian is, right?
I think you would probably have to be.
Because you want to go where the jokes are and you want to be able to think a certain way and then express it. And
that's right.
Yeah. So like every
But here's what I always come up against, and you just brought it up. Years ago, there was a lot of lead in kids' cereal. And through government regulation, the lead was removed. So how do you square that kind of essential tension?
Yeah. So, and this is where I guess I am grounded, because I'm not an anarchist or an anarcho-capitalist, which a lot of people say, where, you know, no government is ever necessary, or kind of the same thing that anything the government does is by force and theft and is illegitimate. And they also suck at everything they do. Why would we have them do anything? Et cetera. You know, that's one strain of kind of libertarian thinking. I'm much more like Milton Friedman, again, you know, a proud New Jerseyan.
Friedman? Where was he from?
He's from, I think he was born in Newark and grew up in Rahway. You know, Rahway's two most famous residents are Milton Friedman and Reuben Hurricane Carter.
I was going to say, if you don't name somebody from the prison, you're just not working hard enough.
But, you know, what I'm interested in, and this is definitely over the course of my career, you know, I've become much more of what I call a directional libertarian, which is that I'm not that interested in like, okay, let's build a perfect philosophical foundation that, you know, makes perfect mathematical and philosophical sense. It's like, are we heading in the direction of more individual freedom, where people can live how they want to, where business owners can do what they want to, where, you know, where things are looser and people are able to make more choices that matter in their lives. For me, the question isn't, you know, whether or not the government is funding something, it's, are we going in the right direction or not? And so to bring that back to this question of regulation of things like lead, you know, the single biggest thing to help air quality in the United States, arguably, was the environmental pollution, you know, kind of standards that were passed in the late 60s and early 70s under the Clean Air Act.
By Nixon, who would be considered at this point, I think, like a gay leftist for Nader. Like he would, you know what I mean? Like we've so shifted in terms of the paradigm, but go ahead.
Yeah. And by banning, you know, and it took many years.
DDT and all those other things.
Well, no, because I'm a libertarian, I will pick a nit with you about DDT in just a second. But with leaded, getting rid of leaded gasoline, you know, and the atmosphere is a common. So it's not like you can't say, oh, you know, the lead you're emitting, you know, I'm going to sue you in court for that, because it would take forever and it's never going to work or anything. But, you know, when there is a true commons, you know, like air can be that
you think the market won't address, like there's too many externalities. And so if the market won't address it, the free market, that's a place where, in your mind, you're able to come in. Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
And, by saying, okay, we're taking leaded gasoline. I mean, most people in America now, I think probably were not, grew up with leaded gasoline versus unleaded, and all of that kind of shit. And it's like by taking leaded gasoline out of the air, that had a major positive effect on,
Right.
On the environment.
Listen, Nick, you and I grew up at the same time in Jersey. Yeah. I'm sure you did what I did, which is ride your bicycle behind mosquito trucks. Like that, we didn't even get excited about the ice cream man coming. It was when the mosquito guy with the giant, he had a pickup truck with a giant fucking fire hose of who knows what. Yeah. And we would ride our bikes behind it and be like, this smells interesting. Just let it wash over us.
Yeah, no, it's like just breathe in. Yeah, breathe in, because you're huffing anyway.
That's right.
So, but this is where you can also do things, even when you're saying like, okay, we're going to build a consensus and say we want to get leaded gasoline out of the air because it has these negative effects. You can do it smarter and dumber. And like the way the government did it, and this was Nixon's EPA said, okay, we're going to mandate catalytic converters, which is a particular type of technology that takes a lot of the lead out of emissions. I mean, as well as changing how we formulate gasoline. It's like the government probably shouldn't be dictating technology, or it could set a goal and say, you have to reduce pollution by so much, but then we're going to let you and we're going to let the market innovate to figure out what's the best way to do it.
Are you for government then incentivizing those kinds of changes? Like, would that be, or is that considered an intervention that sullies a free market?
Yeah, well, it gets complicated pretty quickly, and obviously, right? Yeah, right. But it's where it might be that, we want you to reduce your amount of pollution, however we define it. That's one thing. But then say, oh, and by the way, we're going to give you a massive taxpayer subsidy, and then give taxpayers credits to buy this one kind of technology. It could be a solar panel. I don't think build your own wind farms have taken off yet, but I'm sure they're coming. Like you want to make it as simple as possible to say like, okay, we've come up with like, here are the basic rules. And then what free markets are really good at is figuring out innovative ways to do stuff for lower costs with better outcomes. And that's not always perfect, and it's not always, sometimes it needs a kick in the pants, or sometimes you just need a top-down regulation or restriction on something. But I think things generally work better, when you let markets operate more freely to kind of figure out what people want to, because a lot of times we don't know what we want,
right?
And then how to get there more quickly. With DDT, if I may, just because this...
Oh, all right, yeah. Pick the DDT nit, and then I'll go back to the sort of more macro view, and then we'll get into sort of what's happening today.
Yeah, DDT is a really interesting example the kind of planetary ban, almost complete planetary ban on DDT comes from Rachel Carson in Silent Spring.
Sure.
And she was making a series of cases. And, the modern environmentalist movement in a lot of ways comes out of that book and the movement that she helped inspire. And it turns out that DDT is really good at killing mosquitoes.
The best.
And its banning was not necessarily a good thing because everything has costs and benefits. And it turns out in certain places, people are using lower levels of DDT in order to really powerfully eradicate mosquitoes. We are constantly held captive by these old things like, DDT was killing people, as if like everything good didn't come out of an era where boys were riding spider bikes, jumping ramps into vats of DDT.
Yes.
But it turns out that it gets much more complicated, and it's worth going back and thinking about this stuff. And you mentioned polio. I'm sure we'll talk about Robert Kennedy at a certain point. Robert Kennedy, who's old enough to really remember polio, is like, the polio vaccines have, killed more people than they saved. Right. And it's like, I want to see the kind of stream of iron lungs, going up in front of Health and Human Services.
But it's really difficult right now, Nick, to make those choices and balances, especially now, because you bring up the point about DDT, and you're right. I mean, it was an incredibly effective killer of mosquitoes, which were causing malaria and all kinds of disease. but then it was found to have mutagenic properties and cancer properties. And
well, at certain levels, right?
At certain levels.
Then this is, one of the things I gave a talk last fall, which was about what I call the agony of abundance. Like the biggest problem I think we have today in a kind of macro sense is we forget how to learn from the past. And there was a poll last year, and it's like
Preach.
almost 60% of people last year said that life was better in America in 1974. Well, and I was like, okay,
let's go. Kid.
Yeah, let's go look at 1974. And like the Pinto was the best-selling car in 1974.
Which was invented to make the gremlin feel better about itself, as you know.
Well, I was partial to the Pacer because I just remember them having an ad where a guy delivered a 6-foot sub in the back of the Pacer.
Sure.
But then it was all glass, so it would have, by the time it got there, it would have flies and maggots on it.
I had a gremlin. I was the idiot who worked his whole fucking high school career to buy an $800 off-brown gremlin just to find out it's front heavy and making a left meant you fishtailed into the neighbor's yard. So it was a nightmare.
But the Pinto not only was explosive, literally, but it was a bad car. And like we have done so much better to make better cars, but yet people are constantly being born back into the past, thinking that it was a simple, a simple decision.
A simple time when cars were cars and segregation was allowed. But let's talk about that central tension, because I think this brings up, here's where I probably have the hardest time embracing kind of the foundational philosophy, which would be kind of the way that Jeff Bezos is going with the Washington Post now. Personal liberty and free markets.
Yeah.
And this is the part that's hardest for me, because in my formulation, right? One of the greatest limiters of personal liberties oftentimes turns out to be free markets.
Okay. How and what's an example of that?
All right. So the way I would look at it is this. The greatest inhibitor of personal liberty in my mind is not necessarily overzealous regulation or something along those lines. It's poverty. It's struggle. It's the inability to get enough of the fruits of your labor to allow yourself the personal freedom that you need. Survival and being on a tenuous razor's edge is, for my calculation, the greatest inhibitor of personal liberty. Free markets, the operating system that we're running, capitalism, whether it's free or not, is by its nature exploitative of labor. So their goal is to get you to work for them for the least amount of money they can pay you, because they need to drive the biggest profits, right?
Sure.
So because of that, it's hard for me to reconcile those two dynamics feel at odds.
I totally hear where you're coming from. And libertarianism historically, it's like a post-World War II phenomenon, really a post-1968 phenomenon, really, as an organized movement.
Really? Why 1968, do you think?
Well, it was partly the people who founded the modern Libertarian Party, people who were working at places like Reason, they felt left out of politics. Republicans and Democrats, especially if you're a young man in a draft year and your choice is Richard Nixon or Hubert Humphrey or George Wallace, you're like, okay, where's the exit, right? It's not good, right?
Would you draw it further back to like objectivism, or would you say that?
Yeah. A huge factor. And people like Ayn Rand, I never personally went through an Ayn Rand phase, but she was massive.
You didn't smoke that much pot? See, I went through it.
Oh, wow. The objectivists I knew, they were always like, oh, you should know. They didn't even get drunk, much less smoking weed. So it's like, okay, I'm out.
That was the only time I ever found it interesting.
Because for me, the 1950s, post-war America is the first time when America became, kind of a wealthy country. And also like it was, that's when individual liberty flourished. Like suddenly you had even among minorities who had it really shitty in the 50s, like if you were black, Brown versus Board of Education only took place in 54. Schools didn't get fully desegregated until Nixon in the early 70s. It was bad, but at every level, people were doing so much better, and there was so much more stuff to buy, so many more choices to make on every level. It makes sense that libertarianism started to become more interesting and attractive. I was more into Jack Kerouac and the Beats, who were exploring individual liberty.
The Merry Pranksters and
so these are all like kind of parts of a broad movement. But in any case, I was going to say that I'm a libertarian because I grew up lower middle class, not because it's often characterized as, this is a philosophy for upper middle class people, highly educated people, men mostly, and some women who are like Ayn Rand or something, like, use cigarette holders or something. And my whole point...
Or monocles. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. My whole point, I agree with you in the questions you're asking. I think capitalism, broadly speaking, as an operating system, generates more possibilities for people. I agree, and this is why I'm not an anarchist. When you talk about poor people...
Not even poor people. I mean, like working class or even regular middle class, which is how I grew up. Even that suffers through that kind of more...
Yeah, I guess part of the problem with political discourse in America, and I think it's always been this way, is that, 90% of us say we're middle class. And so you get middle class people, and this happened under, it happened under George W. Bush, it happened under Trump, certainly under Biden, where, suddenly households who are making $400,000 are being subsidized by the government. And you hear this, I'm talking to you from Hell's Kitchen in New York, and you'll hear people in New York say with a straight face, like, oh, making $300,000 in New York just isn't really a lot.
It's just not happening right now.
It's like, we're pinched, and it's like, then move or, whatever. But what I was going to say is that the libertarian argument for helping people who need it and assistance in the market goes something like this, or part of it is that, if you're a kid and your parents, for whatever reason, aren't, they're not well off, you don't have a lot of options, giving kids access to education and to healthcare will allow them to grow so that they can fully participate in society, which is a good thing. Then we can say, okay, well, that's why we have, Medicaid and why we have public schools. And then it might be the case that we say, well, you know what, let's maybe give the parents money so that they can pick the school their kid goes to. Like, the government doesn't have to run the schools, et cetera. But there should be some aid and assistance in the interest of helping people fully participate in society. I think I can make a case that is consistent with libertarian beliefs and a belief in mostly free markets and laissez-faire and certainly personal liberties. That the state can exist to help people in terms of safety nets and in terms of helping to guarantee or at least multiply opportunities. But having said that, the reason why cars became cheaper and better and, isn't because the government said, hey, you know what, we're going to give you, a subsidized loan in order to buy that Gremlin. It actually, cars in America got better and cheaper when you think about it in terms of the amount of work that people have to do to buy them when we opened up to competition. And throughout the, through the mid 70s, car markets in America were basically, it was very hard to get imports. And as a result, we got, the cars that you and I, grew up driving, where, if the one good thing is, I think about this all the time. And again, this is a question of progress that we should not celebrate uncritically, but take note of. I can remember people would have parties on the street if their car made it to 100,000 miles and the odometer went to zero.
The rollover, baby. You had to get to them zeros.
There were like 2 or 3 in your lifetime.
Yeah.
And now you don't even change the spark plugs on a new car until 100,000 miles. And it is true that business owners want to, they want you to work for as little as they have to pay you. But then if you're a good worker, you're going to be competing. Other companies are going to be like, you know what, this guy is actually pretty good at what he's doing. I'm going to woo him away with a better wage.
Yeah, I think that's probably where you and I would would disagree a little bit.
Yeah, no, I also think it's kind of, you can push it too far. I was looking in anticipation for this. I was looking at the percentage of households and whatnot that are on SNAP benefits.
Mhm.
I think almost everybody in America, regardless of political persuasion or ideology or anything, would say, you know what, like, we don't want people to starve.
Yeah, I would even question that at this point.
Okay.
There's a Republican congressman the other day who was like, kids should have to work for their lunch at school. And you're like, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
And by the way, SNAP benefits are controversial.
Yeah.
I mean, they really are within the government. And the other side I would say to it is when governments do provide that, right, they attach all kinds of conditions to it that they don't attach to subsidies that are for corporations.
Or for mortgages and things like that.
Right. I mean, you get billions for, things, and yet food stamps, you're not allowed to buy hot food.
Yeah. No, it drives me nuts. And
Right.
this is, again, from a libertarian point of view, I think you can say, okay, we're going to have certain social welfare, safety net programs. Those are important. But then when you start getting to like, well, okay, people who are making, 3 times the poverty line or something are still getting a benefit. Maybe that's not a great use of taxpayer money because that money's coming from somewhere else. But also, and you find this in all sorts of giveaways under COVID and whatnot, where people just, okay, well, why do seniors get prescription drug benefits, regardless of how much money they make, or why are they getting them anyway if they don't actually need them?
So you're more of you would say means testing is the most important aspect of the safety net.
It's 2 things. One is I would say it would be better to give people like, we know people are poor because they're below the poverty line, like give them cash, just give them cash and say, okay, here, we trust you not to buy, not simply to buy Lettios cereal for your kid.
Which, by the way, they don't. I mean, almost entirely those benefits are used to the positive and not,
absolutely.
The whole idea is like they're gaming the system for gambling money and cigarettes. Like,
yeah,
it's
and it's like, well, they'll figure out how to do that anyway. But what to get to this point, because you mentioned Jeff Bezos, who just recently said, he wants the opinion section of the Washington Post to focus on supporting personal liberties and free markets. And it's true, like when government gives a benefit and then says, oh, but you know what, you have to get the 2% milk or the non-fat milk because we don't trust you to make a good decision. That is so patronizing to my mind. It shouldn't be allowed.
But you're not against the government subsidizing those that are left out of whatever economic prosperity comes from the capitalist system. Which is, I think for a lot of people would be surprising. I've always said, Rand Paul is kind of the avatar for all this in my mind, only because having lobbied down there for Zadroga Act for 9/11 and PACT Act for veterans and other things, I always started to get the impression that like a libertarian was a Republican whose town hadn't been hit by a tornado yet.
Right.
Like it was like no money for Sandy relief. And then Kentucky gets hit by a tornado and they're like, come on, which made me feel like it wasn't a practical operating system for people to be talking about.
You'll have fights over where the line gets drawn. Exactly.
That's right.
Right. And
That's
things
right.
like that. But, to me, it's, that question. And I like the way that you phrase it. It's, it's like, who are the people who are left out? And particularly the people who are left out, through no actions of their own. How do we give them a shot at participating in society?
But Nick, that's a much more charitable view, and this I think is going to surprise people. I think they view libertarianism in some ways as kind of a purist form of a kind of selfishness, right? That you don't do. And I would say that's a more charitable view than I hear from the Republican Party almost in its entirety. I think they view poverty and being left behind as vice, as somehow it went in certain areas. I think if you were to look at like let's say the Midwest and the Rust Belt, right? I think the view there is those poor people. Globalization has hollowed out our manufacturing base. And then you would say, well, what about Chicago and New York City and minority communities? And they would say, pull your pants up and get a fucking job. it's almost an analog of what happened to our manufacturing base, yet viewed almost entirely differently and without any sympathy.
What you're describing is broadly, a lot of Republicans think this way. I think a lot of conservatives. I think liberals go back and forth when you're talking about Chicago, and it's like, oh, we got to help these people. But then if it's some, fat Walmart shopper, in a small town in Indiana, it's like,
right.
Just buck it up, pal.
No, you're right. It does. It goes across lines. People have their prejudices against different groups.
And this is one of the things that is fascinating about Donald Trump, is that he is a master of playing all of this kind of stuff against itself, because, when he's talking about tariffs and when he's talking about help, he just was praising the longshoremen for, getting a good deal by resisting modernization of containerized shipping. It's, he knows how to play all of this.
Do you think that's genuine? Because I find him to be incredibly dismissive of labor and workers, and he views them, I think in his unguarded moments, like the podcast he did with Elon, where he was laughing with Elon about how badly they had cut, the workers at Twitter and unionization being a fool. Where do you think they are in reality?
Well, Donald Trump, and this is probably the only time this sentence has been spoken in the English language. I think of Donald Trump like Bob Dylan. And by that, I mean that he...
Hold on a minute. Are we recording this?
Yeah. He has...
We're certainly blowing in the wind, but what...
A million different persona. And at any given point in time, Bob Dylan absolutely believes what he's singing, and when he was, anti-war, he believed that.
I like this.
When he thought Reuben Carter was innocent, he thought that.
He believes it in the moment.
Yeah, and then when he thought that God was going to come and kill his friends and throw them into a lake of, everlasting hellfire.
It was only a couple of years, Nick. That was only a couple of years.
No, but I'm saying
quick.
But Trump believes what he's saying. So I don't think he's being calculated and saying, I'm screwing around with the longshoremen.
It's a Costanza thing.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not a lie
if
you believe it.
Yeah.
And in that moment, he believes it.
Yeah. But it does get into this larger question for the country. And, surprisingly, I think my worldview would fix just about everything in the world. But
what? Why didn't we talk to you sooner, Nick?
I've been waiting. Yeah. What we have now is a government that pretty much at all levels, but certainly at the federal level, is spending way too much. It cannot or won't raise revenue to cover its costs. So it's creating debt. And we can talk about why debt is a problem beyond, some kind of, accounting fetish. But the government is trying to do so many things. It is doing them poorly, and it's unsustainable. And I think, we're reaching a moment where this long period after World War II and even after the Cold War ended, where, okay, there's a reset coming. And you can't keep spending, $7 trillion a year and taking in $4.5 trillion, which is what we're doing. And we're going to have to make choices. And this is where, I think if we would say, here's the goal of government. The goal of government is not to make sure that everybody everywhere keeps the job they had when they were 25, even if they're 65. But it's like government is here to provide several core functions and to kind of keep things moving in a direction. Then how do we pay for that? Like, how much does that cost? How do we pay for it? And how do we empower people to use, right, whatever money we're given?
Listen, I think you're putting your finger on the essential questions that we talk about. I guess the way that I would maybe address that is slightly different, which is government exists, getting back to the operating system being capitalism.
Yeah, which is a wonderful metaphor for everything.
In my mind, the government exists to soften the blow that by definition, exploitative system is going to extract. Capitalism is extractive. They're goods, raw materials, labor. It's got to be the cheapest, drive the highest profits. And the people that will benefit that are necessarily a smaller slice of people because it's a shareholder operation, not a people operation. And the labor is not valued in the same way that investment or capital is. Capital is king.
Can I push on this a little bit? Because what I was going to challenge is like capitalism is inherently exploitative, and that labor is always getting, punched in the head or hit in the kidneys with a baseball bat by, who was the guy and on the waterfront, Johnny Friendly, I think. No.
How did he get that name? He wasn't.
No, I mean, and maybe he had a bouncer who was really fat that they called Tiny. I think it was an ironic universe.
Oh, right? That's how it worked.
Yeah. But I don't necessarily agree with that. And in a lot of ways, I would push back on it because when you talk about, the boss man. And, now we're back in Springsteen universe, right? Because for Bruce Springsteen, things have never recovered from the Great Depression. He's still mumbling along the mean streets of Rumson with his hat in his hand.
You know what? We can argue about economic systems, but you were in dangerous territory, my friend. Dangerous territory.
But what I'm getting at is that, employers are desperate, generally speaking. Like if you are a good employee, and I worked as a manager at Reason for 20 plus years, like if there was somebody who was putting in a better, than average effort, I would do everything to keep them, including, paying them more money.
But you're running a small business. Reason is a small, it's not a I'm talking writ large about multinational corporations. And I'll make the case, I think, because if you look at wealth in systems that are poorly regulated in terms of capitalism, right? There is, in the same way that political power is accrued through a kind of contrived incumbency, I think wealth also accumulates through a contrived incumbency by those that are wealthy. And what you find is, so let's go back to times when capitalism was less fettered, and that would be sort of Gilded Age, as it moves through. It's one thing to say, oh, competition, iron tempers iron, it makes everybody stronger and it gets strong. But what happens is, as we've seen with monopolistic tendencies in capitalism, once wealth is accrued, it becomes much easier to then keep tilting the table more in their favor. And it almost inexorably, it's a law of nature. It's a kind of Newton's law.
I hear you, but we will disagree with this. We'll disagree to a large degree on this. And
okay.
I don't think it changed, but and I'm not saying that there weren't times where capitalism was red in tooth and claw and exploitative.
When was it not? I guess that would be the easier question.
Well, the reason what I'm getting at is saying that when you if you go back, and this is something, there's a type of school of economic thought called public choice economics, which talks about how, the story that progressives tell, capital P progressives in particular, tell about capitalism is that it was awful.
Not awful, but it's a system that requires exploitation and extraction.
Well, here, but so
I mean, it generates but more wealth than any other system, no question. But that wealth accumulates unusually at the top. You brought up earlier the 50s, which I thought was a great time, and you're right. But tax rates then were 80% or 90%, and the GI Bill, which was a giant government expense, is what helped build that stable middle class that you're talking about.
Well, first off, nobody paid those tax rates because those were the printed rates. No, seriously. But that's why things like expense accounts, and all sorts of things were invented for upper level people.
Sure. And they cut all kinds of deductions. And
the main engine.
Rich people always find a way out of it. True.
The main engine of things like people being able to buy their own homes and whatnot, it was increases in productivity through industrialization and mechanization. I would argue it was not unionization. It wasn't the GI Bill. I'm not saying those things didn't have an effect, but that it's because we became wealthier, because suddenly we were building an economy that used machines and other things to become massively more productive. Wages went up, not because...
But not at the same rate as productivity. You will always find that wages do not match productivity gains. They'll always lag.
Sometimes they're higher, sometimes
Right.
sometimes they're
Mostly-
lower. But like right now
Yeah.
in America, we have like the highest median household income that we've ever had, adjusted for inflation.
Maybe I'm wrong about this. Isn't 50 to 60% of Americans living paycheck to paycheck?
No, well, you have to look into what that means. 60+ % of Americans own their own home, compared to in the 50s, it was much lower. They have college educations, they have more stuff.
Oh, you're saying that our standard of living is now higher comparatively.
Massively higher. And food is cheaper. Everything is more abundant. Plus you get the personal liberty stuff, which I think is part of capitalism. I don't think, it's not like capitalism is an economic thing and then, you can, it's the weekend and you're going to go to Plato's Retreat or Studio 54. They're all part of a same system, right?
Right.
Having said all of that, I mean, just to get back to it, it's like what
Yes.
capitalism does, and there's an economist named Joseph Schumpeter, the guy who coined the term creative destruction. And in a book during World War II called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, he said, the great achievement of capitalism was not making more silk stockings for the queens of England, the queens of Europe, but bringing them in reach of factory girls.
You're saying the Henry Ford, the sort of the mechanization of goods and services allowed more people, which I don't in any way quibble with. I think that's why we use this operating system. I'm just saying the basis of this operating system is inequality, and you see it in fits and starts. It's why economics goes through cycles, and that, like, if we hadn't have done the New Deal, we'll talk about it this way: government intervention to ease the burden of those who are not able to protect their wealth through incumbency and really profit at that arithmetic or geometric level from the fruits of capitalism is what preserves the stability of the system. If we went more libertarian, I think you'd find the system is too volatile, and revolution, if we don't make, revolution then becomes much more inevitable.
So you've heard of the economic crash, massive economic crash that happened in the early 20s. That was like bigger than the stock market crash in 1929.
No.
Yeah, and the government didn't do anything, and the stock market recovered very quickly.
You're suggesting that after 1929, if we hadn't have gotten the New Deal, everything would have been fine.
I'm not saying everything would have been fine and it would have been difficult, but the New Deal, it's worth going back and looking at, how did the New Deal affect the economy, and did it string out bad times? Because there are two economic depressions in the 30s that economists talk about, and that every government intervention has costs and benefits, and oftentimes we have lost sight of things.
Well, let's use a more a more recent example, which would be the 2008 financial crisis versus the pandemic.
Yeah.
In 2008 financial crisis, it's caused by risk-taking behavior within our investment economy.
And particularly, that was behavior that was heavily incentivized by the federal government in terms of guaranteeing mortgage loans and things like that. And buying all
Freddie
of
Mae
the
and
paper.
those guys got into the game pretty late. And I think you'd be hard pressed to say that the hedge funds did it because they thought the government incentivized it.
No, I mean, but it was the Federal Reserve, first off, kept interest rates artificially low for a long time. And then the government had a policy of its, government-sponsored entities of buying up all of the mortgage paper that was going. So banks did not do the due diligence.
But they jumped into that later.
Everybody has, some schmutz on their hands from all of this. But
it's funny. I think you and I, I'm kind of interested in this because I think where you and I would like society to settle is probably almost the same place.
Absolutely.
I think you and I would look at it as, and here's my path to get there. And you would say, here's my path. And you've got to trust both of those paths. You got to go. And ultimately, you got to trust me.
Yeah. Well,
that's where it comes down to theology.
I would argue that it's also, we would probably agree on similar on a similar path, because I suspect, I was looking this up beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
In 2001, which was Bill Clinton's final budget year as president, he left office in 2000 or early 2001 fiscal year. last, a little bit longer, he spent less than $2 trillion, or that was the entire federal budget. We are over $7 trillion now. In 2019, the year before COVID, we were spending $4.4 trillion a year. That went up to $6.6 trillion in 2020. It is now $7.2 trillion in spending. And I suspect that you would agree with me that we should not be, it's not clear why we're spending $7.2 trillion.
Well, I certainly don't think we're spending it effectively. I think that's for sure.
But like, why at all? Like, how do you go from, we're post-COVID.
So here's what I would say with that. There are different ways to stimulate the economy. So I think since Reagan, and probably before that, probably Carter, there has been the idea that supply side, sort of what they would call neoliberal policy, is the best way to stimulate the economy, which means that the money, tax cuts for incentivizing wealthier people and corporations and allowing for more M&A and allowing for consolidation within industries, which in some ways, these really, it's the rise of these gigantic multinational corporations. And it gets back to sort of what we're talking about in 2008 versus the pandemic. In 2008, the crash came from the financialization of all these products. It came from the white collar markets. We bailed them out as taxpayers,
which I would totally against that. And,
as was I.
Yeah,
but not against bailing out homeowners. That's maybe where you and I would differ.
It depends, but yeah.
But in the pandemic, when the era that rent assistance went out and the $600, the stimmy went out, what it showed to me was it took us 10 years. It took us a decade after 2008 to even get back to a semblance of where we were. The pandemic, it took us a year or a year and a half financially to be back. What it says is, in my mind, direct stimulus at a demand side level is far more fiscally responsible than these trickle-down neoliberal policies. I think we can spend less and get more.
We can definitely be more effective in intervening in economic, situations. I don't think part of the government's role should be like, hey, you know what, it's not like going to a personal trainer and you come in and they're like, hey, you're looking a little fat. Let's do some abs today, and have the government constantly be smoothing the economy. Or I think it's hubris to think that it can control things. It's one thing when you have a catastrophic adventure.
But isn't it to prevent more catastrophic adventure at some level?
Well, this is where, this
is where the theology comes in.
No, but it's also like, remember, in the early 2000s, we had the tech bubble crash.
Yes.
And then we had a bunch of, accounting rules that were going to make sure that, the financial sector never fucked around with shit anymore. Then, the financial crisis hits. I would argue, is largely because of government actions, or was heavily abetted by government actions, as well as greed and
But don't
whatnot.
you think those actions were all influenced by the lobbyists from the when the government sets out to do something smart, that gets watered down almost immediately by the moneyed interests.
This is, public choice economics talks about how, like, we think people want to think of the government as acting somehow differently than the private sector, but It's oftentimes completely captured by the interests that it's supposed to regulate, or it is also just trying to build its own empire. So it's going to try and regulate more and more stuff.
So is the idea, Nick, if we were to boil this down, let me ask you this. Is the idea maybe that's fundamental to our disagreement that because government can be captured by the same corrupt and corrosive interests that maybe business can be captured by? And I remember having Greenspan on the show and saying, why did we have a crisis in 2008? And he said, well, I think we thought that the banks would have done a better job of regulating themselves. And I was like, well, yeah, I didn't. Yeah. But the point being, is the only way to prevent that to remove government? Is that your sort of foundational principle?
Not necessarily remove it completely, but minimize its attempt to rig the system in favor of particular outcomes, whether that's for the little guy or the big guy or whatever.
And let the natural order, and you don't fear the natural order will be that the little guy's got no chance against money.
Yeah, I don't, and I say this again, this is coming from, my father was born in Hell's Kitchen in the 1920s. He did okay. I did much better than him. What I'm getting at is the idea that I actually think that capitalism offers more opportunities specifically for people to rise up from the, the lower classes and the middle classes.
You mean as opposed to communism or socialism? Is
Yeah,
that what you mean?
or like, a super regulated market where you're only getting into schools because of, what family you come from and all of this kind of stuff.
Which is still a large part of the operating system that we work
absolutely.
with.
No, and nothing is perfect, right? Nothing is perfect. But, we came out of the financial crisis with, now we know we're not going to do anything too big to fail, right? And it's like, in fact, the financial industry, the financial sector is more is more concentrated than it ever was. And everybody in it knows that, like, oh, no, we're too big to fail, which also means we can fuck around and find out how bad.
That's right.
So what I'm saying
just watch us.
Yeah, this the government, it is a very tricky thing. And once you start thinking like, okay, the government can control stuff and make good outcomes, like it does until, you realize, oh, this was a big catastrophe. And I think with something like the COVID stuff, when we're talking about, there's economic issues which are worth talking about. And I think, the massive increasing and extending of unemployment benefits was really bad. And it's generated so much debt that is going to, that's not going away, even if like the annual GDP growth is increasing and things like that. There were so many interventions into the economy where if the government had done smaller targeted things for shorter times, I think we would be better off.
Well, I think they were also not practiced with demand side stimulus. And so maybe they just didn't understand quite what the real value of it was, because the amount of economic activity it generated, even with wrecked supply chains. But so this brings us sort of around. And Nick, I can't thank you enough for sitting and having the conversations, because there's so much in it that is relevant to today, but also so many places of agreement that people may not have thought.
Well, this is not an extreme philosophy, and it is not a fringe philosophy. It is most people,
although can be exploited as such by people.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. And it can be vilified wrongly, and it can be taken in bizarre directions and stuff. But like basically what you're talking about is like, you want to live in a world where you can, figure out who you are and build the world that you want to live in. And, and not to get too libertarian, on this, like, it means, that like, if you want to, if you want to marry, if you're a man and you want to marry a man, anything that is among consenting adults is good. If you want to smoke weed rather than, drink whiskey, like, you shouldn't go to prison for that. And it shouldn't be illegal to buy and sell this shit. And, and if you want to run a business that does this versus that, like, anything that's peaceful.
And coming from somebody who still believes in government's ability to give people help, yes.
Yeah.
I also believe government is far too onerous, far too bureaucratic. If I could give it anything, it would be a moonshot to dispel unnecessary paperwork and to make it so that they don't have such ridiculous rules for every project that has to satisfy every interest group that ever walked the earth.
But that's part of what government is designed to do, right? I mean, I don't think that's a bug. I think that's a feature
maybe
of government. And you would argue capitalism's the feature.
That's what I'm saying. Right.
It is like, really, no, we need more girls in the shirt waist triangle factory.
I mean, in some respects, like, because they started off with imperialism and colonialism and slavery. Yeah. And so everything that they give us from that feels like, it's a concession. What are you talking about? We're paying you. You're not a slave.
Yeah.
Let's flip it now to at least what's happening now, because I think, there is a feeling that the Trump administration is libertarian friendly, and that DOGE is libertarian friendly. And I guess my vision of what they're doing does not match. Like, the idea that, RFK Jr. is a give to libertarians seems crazy to me. But or that any of this is, they're not talking about freedom. They're talking about fealty, and they're talking about yes, free speech is a wonderful value unless we don't like it, and we will bring to bear an even more authoritarian way to. So how are you feeling?
It's a fascinating kind of question, and I can't really speak for other libertarians.
Sure.
But, what I liked about Trump winning is that I think it put a cap on a broad series of developments and kind of policies and attitudes that had settled over the country, kind of like, a DDT fog that wasn't going away.
Are you saying I'm riding my bike behind the Trump administration as a fire hose?
Popping a wheelie on my banana seat and all this. But and that had to do, there were certain things about wokeness and about kind of, policing of speech in a public way that was onerous. And the only solution to that really is for people to say, like, you know what, I'm not going to allow you to call me a racist. And I'm going to speak my mind. I'm going to be public about that.
Do you think that's purely a purview of the left?
No. I mean, this is, people are now talking about the woke left is being replaced by the woke right. And, the idea that, policing language so that, if you're in the presence of Trump or a Trump-tard and you call it the Gulf of Mexico, they will be like, you no longer exist to me or something. And like, this is not progress by any stretch.
See, I always looked at it more as a function of social media, which kind of gave the villagers who wanted pitchforks and torches a way to go after everybody. And and that includes, by the way, things that have nothing to do with politics. If you were to criticize, One Direction, you would get a shitstorm coming your way.
Oh, it was great, though. And I like that. I mean, I think it's empowering, even as it fractures us. But
well, that's the other side, is that's people expressing their speech.
Yeah. And I was early on in Twitter, or not that early on, but I remember when Bill Cosby, he was coming back with like a Netflix special and a tour and stuff like that. And he had a Twitter feed, an official Twitter feed, and they would put out stuff saying like, hey, Dr. Cosby wore great sweaters on the Cosby Show. Post your favorite sweater. And everybody just like immediately went after him for all of the sexual assault and rape allegations. And it's like, that's a world I want to live in, where like the big people and the little people are suddenly kind of in the same room. And that can be terrifying. It's especially terrifying if you're a big person, right?
See, I never had look, I feel like I operate a small artisanal talk shittery. And if people want to like operate their talk shittery back at me, that is only fair. So I guess I'm trying to separate wokeness from people just giving each other incessant shit about everything.
But then you get to places where it becomes implemented in terms of various kinds of speech codes, as well as hiring policies at universities, at corporations, because corporations are just doing whatever they can do to make the next buck.
I got a bumper sticker, corporations are pussies. Like they don't want any trouble. Like, I'll tell you what, in terms of content creation, the biggest sort of censoring blanket that went over show business, I didn't think was wokeness. It was when Ron DeSantis sued Disney.
Yeah.
As soon as that happened, you saw people back off of content that they thought, or like when Trump threatens to jail Zuckerberg.
Right.
I guess that's my problem, is just the hypocrisy of it all.
I know. I'll say, because you brought this up. You had a really good and powerful and instructive moment when you were raising questions about the lab leak theory on the on Stephen Colbert's show.
On Colbert's show, on the Late Show.
And again, it's like, what we found under Biden, and I suspect if you go back far enough, there was some of this under Trump and under Obama and Bush, and like back before the FCC,
Nixon.
All of this stuff, but where the government was actively leaning on people to say, do not permit this discussion or tamp it down, et cetera.
Have they ever not?
Less now than ever. And this is one of the things, to bring it back to Trump, he signed an executive order saying that nobody in his administration should be trying to shut down conversation on social media. Does he mean that? I don't know. But that's good. But then
I can tell you he doesn't mean it. I think it's pretty obvious he doesn't mean it. I've honestly never seen a president, and I know they lean on people. I'm not naive. I've never seen someone threaten to jail people who don't use the terminology. I've seen them try and reveal sources in a way that I thought was, I think what they did to Snowden was insane.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
all those different things. I've seen it, but he's making it explicit, and yet was hailed as the free
Yeah.
speech.
So
king.
what I will say, and again, this is, I didn't vote for Trump. I voted for the Libertarian candidate because, why not? But
Yeah.
Trump will be ineffective in he's not going to actually jail people.
But isn't the threat of it all that matters?
It's terrible. No, it is.
Yeah, whether he jails them or not is kind of not the issue.
It's not all that matters, but it is bad, and he should be called out for it. I mean, in a way, Trump, his whole career, his whole politics career is the triumph of talkback, of telling the system, go fuck yourself, because nobody wanted him. The Republicans didn't want him originally. Nobody wanted him. So in a way, he personifies a world in which we are freer than ever to just say, fuck it, I'm doing whatever I want.
Unless it's against him.
Yeah, as president, It is an awful thing. And when you look at governors, DeSantis did this, Greg Abbott in Texas did this too, where they started writing laws that were tailored to screw over social media companies they didn't like because they thought they were censoring conservative voices, which turned out not to be true.
Or educators that were teaching in a way that they didn't. For all the complaints of the woke left, they've rarely ensconced it in law in the way that the right has.
Yeah. You could argue they didn't have to, maybe, but it's all bad. Like anytime the government, Congress shall make no law, abridging speech. That's it. Like, and that should be the case at the state level too, and all of that.
Are you aligning with their other goals of, like I personally, if you could make government more efficient, oh my God. I don't necessarily know that that's what they're doing. It feels awfully inefficient the way they're doing it, but
and it's a real mix of for me, the biggest problems with Trump as a figure had to do with immigration policy and tariffs. And he's just categorically awful.
A libertarian would not be protectionist in terms of, you even made the point earlier in terms of cars.
Yeah.
You think that opening up that competition. But let me ask you this. Maybe this is a different way to frame kind of DEI. So for me, if you reframe that argument economically, it maybe aligns a little bit more with how you feel. Because what I think diversity and inclusion and equity means, maybe not in the practice, and I don't think it means sitting through that hour-long seminar where everybody looks at each other and goes, I never said that about her ass. Like, it's not that. But I look at it as more competition. Right. We have supply lines in this country, entrenched poverty, and groups that have been explicitly kept out of, equity through government action and all kinds of other ways. If you reanimate those supply lines, you strengthen the don't think of it as diversity. Think of it as emerging markets. Yeah. Think of it as that. And suddenly you view it as an engine of economic growth.
Right. I mean, is there a sports league that got worse after blacks were allowed to play? And in every possible way, right?
Right.
It's like, you were walling off a huge source of,
but
powerful
we do that.
Possibilities.
Veterans have been walled off in many ways. Yeah. Women were walled off. Yeah. People in poverty-stricken neighborhoods are walled off. Appalachia has been walled off forever. That, to me, that's what inclusion and diversity and equity means.
Unfortunately, those policies never had any, they weren't reaching those people
because they're doing what they can, not what they should. What they're allowed to do is you can't address those shriveled supply lines and reanimate them and get those, communities involved. So here's what we're going to let you do. We're going to let you have an office on the 8th floor, and every April you're going to give us a presentation for 2 hours that everybody hates. How about that?
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing. Are you excited about that project of DOGE? Do you think it will bear fruit?
Yeah, I am very excited by the idea of having, a government that has done an audit of its workforce end of its activities.
Which, by the way, I think it does do. I think it mostly ignores it. Almost every department there has to be audited. Only defense doesn't pass them, but they do that.
Yeah, no, well, actually, there's more like that. And, and this is, I was excited the other day when there were a bunch of tweets, saying that, DOGE has entered the Pentagon. And it's like, okay, yeah, this should be very interesting, right? And then
the question is, what are the metrics they're looking for? Because cutting all the probation, I just don't know yet if they're actually looking at value or they're just looking at size.
That's right. And, a good example of this, an economist friend of mine wrote about how at the FDA, they had cut 200 regulators, like people who actually go through stuff to see whether or not
the very people who are doing it.
Yeah. And if you keep the regulations in place and cut the workforce that is going to see if they're complying, like you just make everything worse. And this is where I think the Trump administration, not across the board, but in certain circumstances, may actually be a good thing. So you take the FDA, they named a guy, Marty Makary, who's a professor from Johns Hopkins, who's pretty smart. He'll be reporting, I guess, ultimately to Robert F. Kennedy, which is, a whole other weird bag of weird, right? I don't know, but if the FDA, and this is something coming out of a libertarian perspective and analysis, like if the FDA, it costs way too much to bring new drugs to market. It takes too long and it takes too long and costs too much.
Right.
There are ways to bring more drugs to market without compromising safety. And if the government would restructure the FDA, and Makary has talked about this, RFK, and the second, his deputy at Health and Human Services have talked about ways to do this. Like, if they do that so that it doesn't take a couple $2 billion in 12 years to bring a new drug to market, that's a big win. And that is something that we could completely do. We could do it overnight.
Until the shit hits the fan. The problem with government, that using sort of first principles of business, like when I look at Elon, right, what he's been able to accomplish, like however you want to feel about him, it's pretty fucking remarkable.
Yeah, totally.
But it's a different ethos. Like you have to blow up a shit ton of rockets before you figure out the right way. And the problem in the public sphere is the public demands agility and also perfection. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of like the same way with our criminal justice system. We demand perfection, that anybody who's ever let out of prison cannot recommit a crime, or else we have to make the system utterly ridiculous.
In its best iteration, or its best kind of sense, if DOGE is going to help us go through and just trim out, clean out the house, there's just too much shit in the house, that would be great.
Man, I just don't have confidence yet that's...
I agree, because of the question, are they doing it well? I have been thinking about this, Elon is bragging about how, he's got like a bunch of preteen coders who are quants, and they can go through spreadsheets, and the stuff they're finding, they keep finding massive mistakes, like where they were claiming a contract they ended with ICE was at $8 billion and it was actually $8 million and things like that. Like, I worry that we're seeing a different iteration of that, where people think because you can fucking do Excel, you suddenly have wisdom. That's going to be problematic.
I'll go beyond that, Nick. I think it's actually, the bigger problem is it's ideologically antagonistic, that they are viewing those people immediately through the prism of a parasitic relationship to our money, and viewing them immediately as enemies and suspicious. And even in the sense of when they sent the email, it is in no way an unreasonable expectation that people who work for you, you would want to know what they're doing and that they've been doing something. But if you don't work in that department and just say to them, what have you been doing? And they tell you, you don't know if that's what they're supposed to be doing or not. Meanwhile, they have to spend all this fucking time figuring it out, which is inefficient.
And people at, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, and National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard said, hey, don't comply with this. So you're already at odds. Having said that, it is important. And this is where, Trump won. And more important, like he gained in almost every possible demographic subgroup. So people are ready for a change. And
No
that's
question.
the most important thing. And I think Trump has set the stage for this, and he's opened up ground where we can start having more conversations. It's up to each of us to come up with like, okay, this is the way it should go. Like I was saying to my wife earlier this morning, like I would love to go to Mars in my life, but I don't want to fly there with Elon Musk sitting next to me. Right?
That's your breakfast conversation? What's that, over egos? What are we talking about, Nick? Have you guys run out of shit to talk about?
Yeah, we've only been married like less than 6 months. So
wait, is that really true?
This. Yes.
Oh, congratulations.
No. In any case, so what we're at, we are at a place where we understand, this is why the Republican Party and the Democratic parties don't make sense. Like since the end of World War II, certainly the end of the Cold War, maybe even the beginning of the century, like it's all kind of played out and it's not working that well. Like we need to, maybe the house isn't a complete teardown, but we need to clean it up. We need to repaint it. We need to say, you know what, we're going to sublet that whole part of it. Like we don't need to be doing that. And that's really important and vital. And I agree with you in this sense of like saying if it's adversarial, if everything becomes adversarial, then what we've this whole century, we've been going between, control, whole or partial control of the White House and the House of Representatives and the Senate, from Republicans to Democrats, back and forth in a way that hasn't been seen in over a century. And it's because we haven't figured out a new consensus that is actually that people can live with. And so we just go from Biden being insane in this direction, now Trump, and we're not getting to a resolution. I think we have the moment to do that.
I think there's great opportunity, and I agree with you with that. No, and I think it's true. And listen, I think one of the things I would say is a lot of people, I think you and I included, agree with a lot of the diagnoses. That we look at these issues and we say it's sclerotic, or, I would look at it as there's a really tough counterbalance now, and that democracy is a, by nature, kind of analog system, and we live in a digital world, and those tensions are really hard to resolve. But I would say in that moment, probably the conversation is about the remedies. And I'm looking at it right now with great fear that this is not the remedy that will bring that opportunity for that moment.
Well, I think it is the opportunity, that's here. And then the remedies that are being proffered are not great. What is interesting is to see, we're not even 100 days in, right, to Trump. It's like a month and change, right?
Honestly, it feels like he's never not been president. I don't remember. I don't know. I've said this before. The presidency is supposed to age the president, not the people. I am withering.
Yeah, it's really, really hard to think back even 6 months to what was going on. But again, it's helpful and it's essential because, when we look back at where we were, like we've gone through most of this stuff before and we figured out ways to kind of improve on the past or to, be better at what we're doing. And I think we need to do that. And I think it's, right now in a way, Trump has the high ground for a little while, but this is also true of every president. By the summer, we'll know whether or not he is popular, like if his specific fixes are popular or not. I suspect that they will be less popular over time. But again, some of them, like, let's legalize drugs at the federal level and just stop worrying about a whole bunch of shit we've been worried about for 100 years. Let's come to, there is a broad recognition that the U.S. should not be the world's policeman.
But apparently the developer of Gaza?
Apparently
we shouldn't be the world's policeman, but we should just annex territories and build casinos there.
This is where it's confusing, and we need to get to a place where the solutions that are being discussed are actually good and legitimate. And it'll be interesting to see if the Democrats, very bothered by people being like, oh my God, the Democrats have nobody. The Republicans will win every election for the next 1,000 years.
Because that's how history works.
Yeah, everybody has said that when Bush was elected and then reelected, and then when Obama.
I'm old enough to remember when Fukuyama said history was over.
Yeah.
That we were just done. We had triumphed. It was over.
And he was, in a way, he was right in saying, that liberal democracy is the way forward.
But even that's in retreat now. Even that's
kind of. But it's also true that China is not democratic,
no.
But it's more capitalist than it was when he said that.
But state-run capitalism is not free markets, and that would be antithetical to everything that and the more we become like Russia, the less we become like the free markets.
I totally agree with that. But all I'm saying in China is that people are getting richer around the globe. I mean, one of the most important and fascinating facts that nobody discusses, and I think this should be talked about much more, there is a global middle class. The majority of people on the planet are at the middle class or above level for the first time in human history.
Is that really true? That's actually very surprising to me. Because I would not
There's a guy named Romy Karas at the Brookings Institution that's been writing about this for a decade. And most of it is happening in Asia and in Africa and South America. And so we don't really care about that. But you know what happens? What happens when middle people, get a little bit of extra money and then you say, oh, here, you've got more money in the bank, but you can't spend it the way you want to. People are like, fuck you. And this is a good problem to have globally and things like that. But
this is what I want to happen for the United States. I want there to be these, as we talked earlier, I want those entrenched places of poverty. I think those are great, untapped engines of progress for things. But Nick, I'm cognizant of your time. I really appreciate the conversation. I've enjoyed it so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it too. And it is, one of the things that you're doing, which I think a lot of people who would identify themselves, as not being a, Republic, like a MAGA Republican, right? Like you are not freaking out in the way that,
externally, I am not.
But everybody is so oppositional that it's like, you're either voting for Harris or you're voting for Trump. And if you're not totally on board, people don't want to talk to you.
Well, there's a purity test and a litmus testing in almost everything.
But there are more people now, and this continues to grow, that are independent. And we can argue about whether or not there are real independents politically, but fewer and fewer people are willing to identify as Democratic or Republican in polls. And that's saying something. And it means that these organizations don't represent the large masses of people anymore. And parties work better when they figure out, okay, where's the majority at? And how do we deal with that?
Well, it's funny. It's almost like we have a parliamentary country in a two-party government, and it makes it, like you say, it really makes it incredibly, complex. But I'd love to have the conversation again. We'll pick it up again. To see where everything's
Let's
been going.
go to a child-run factory in Bangladesh. Is there a budget for that?
Always so cheery. The always cheery Nick Gillespie, as the jersey comes out of him. Editor-at-large of The Reason Magazine, host of the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie podcast. Nick, thank you so much for spending the time today. Really, really enjoyed it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you, John.
I love talking to that guy. I felt like he's so smart and he's got such a breadth of knowledge. And even though we obviously we disagree on, especially I thought the biggest one was capitalism being exploitative. That surprised me. I do think it's an engine of prosperity, but it very clearly has losers. So, but I thought it was a very interesting conversation and I very much enjoyed it.
Did we ever get that definition of libertarianism? I
don't know that there is one. It's whatever you want it to be.
I think something that really stood out was just while Jillian and I looking into this episode, just how diverse libertarians are.
Really much so.
And I think a good example of that is the fact that some people feel RFK is within the libertarian camp. And most libertarians also think that Ross Ulbricht is in the camp. So one person, for legalizing drugs and the other for banning red dye number 3.
Yep. Hey, look, and in this world order now, it's like Andrew Tate is the libertarian
Oh,
king.
boy.
You're like, yeah, I don't
Yeah.
think that's what they're talking about. I think it's like a different philosophy. But he's an OG.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I spent a few days kind of in their quarter of the public square.
Mhm.
And while I vehemently disagree with a lot of the things that they believe in, I did appreciate that they don't arrive at those ideas with the same gleeful cruelty that you see in right-wing media, and they don't filter everything through that lens. It's
clear
Yeah.
there's a real intellectual, anybody who's coming at you with, Friedman and Hayek as the foundation of what they're talking about isn't just in it for the dank Pepe the Frog
Yeah.
memes.
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice to be presented with ideas I don't agree with in ways that I don't have to recoil from.
Bars. Jillian, put that on a pillow. I like that very much. Brittany, are people just writing in today to see if I'm still alive? Because it appears the fragility of when you cut your finger. I literally got a call from my mom. Or like, are you okay? I'm like, you were with me in childhood. I'm like, I ran headfirst into trees. What are you talking about, woman?
People are very concerned about your well-being. So it's nice to see you.
When you're anemic to begin with.
We did get one feedback that I'd love to read to you.
Please.
John, I love you, but if you keep using the line, democracy is an analog system in a digital world, I'm going to lose my mind.
I did it again today.
I know.
Why? What do they think is it too cliched? Is it trite? What's the issue, you think?
Well, listen to the rest of this.
Okay.
I could get drunk in a drinking game for every time you say that.
That is true.
Much love, brother. But really.
Well, we've been playing a drinking game this whole time, so.
Wait, I got to say, though, it'd be a drinking game over a period of months, which seems like a long time to keep a drinking. I wish they'd put in there why. So now I don't know if they think that's incorrect or just overused. Overused, definitely. It's sort of like when you're trying to make something happen and then it doesn't happen.
Like fetch?
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
It's my version of fetch. But maybe that he'll write back and tell us.
We're going to respond to him.
Or after listening to this episode, he may be too drunk. Where else? Have them to keep it coming. Where? How can they keep it coming?
Twitter, we are Weekly Show Pod. Instagram, Threads, TikTok, Blue Sky, we are Weekly Show Podcast. And you can subscribe, and comment on our YouTube channel, The Weekly Show with Jon Stewart.
Bang on. Guys, thank you as always for the incredible preparation and detail that you provide in every episode that allows me to just sit and talk to somebody. Lead producer, Lauren Walker, producer, Brittany Mehmetovic, video editor and engineer, Rob Vitola, audio editor and engineer, Nicole Boyce, researcher and associate producer, Jillian Spear, and as always, our executive producers, Chris McShane and Katie Gray. Guys, thank you so much. That was a really fun episode, and I will see you all next week. The Weekly Show with Jon Stewart is a Comedy Central podcast. It's produced by Paramount Audio and Busboy Productions.